George Harrison, the quietest of the Beatles, carried a silent bitterness throughout much of his career with the band. While he never raised his voice, publicly or in interviews, the frustration he felt over being overshadowed by John Lennon and Paul McCartney grew steadily over the years. Harrison, a naturally introverted person, joined the Beatles at the age of 15, quickly being swept up in the success of Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership. Although his talent was undeniable, Harrison often felt his contributions were underappreciated. His introspective nature led him to explore spirituality and music beyond the band's mainstream pop sound. But despite his growing talents, Harrison found himself sidelined, both creatively and personally. His quiet resentment festered over time, marking the Beatles' later years with a sense of growing disillusionment, especially toward McCartney, who was often controlling in the studio. A teenage guitarist's beginnings, George Harrison's musical journey began as a teenager in Liverpool, where he met Paul McCartney while riding a school bus. Though McCartney was older and more confident, Harrison, with his quiet nature and budding talent, felt a connection with Paul's passion for music. In 1958, at the age of 15, George joined John Lennon's Quarrymen. Lennon initially dismissed him due to his youth, but McCartney intervened and arranged for George to have a second audition. It was during this audition that George played the lead guitar line from Raunchy, impressing Lennon and securing his place in the band. Despite his early start with Lennon and McCartney, George was often overshadowed. Lennon and McCartney dominated the songwriting process, while Harrison quietly absorbed their influence, waiting for his moment to shine, but that moment would be slow to come. The struggles of being the quiet Beatle. As the Beatles rose to fame, George earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle. Though the media romanticized his introverted nature, those closest to him knew the truth. It wasn't just shyness, but a deep frustration with being sidelined. His ideas and musical contributions were often dismissed or second-guessed, particularly by Paul McCartney, who, as a perfectionist, tended to dominate the band's creative process. In time, George felt increasingly suffocated and stifled. He had musical ambitions of his own, and while he began to develop as a songwriter, his efforts were frequently overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney's dominance. This slow buildup of frustration would eventually turn into resentment. His relationship with Paul became strained, with George feeling that his growth as a musician was hindered by the constant control of his bandmates. Breaking point, the Let It Be sessions. By 1968, George had grown confident enough in his musical abilities to challenge the dynamic within the Beatles. During the White Album sessions, George proposed his own songs, which were often dismissed or overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney's influence. Tensions reached their peak during the Let It Be sessions in early 1969. While recording the song Two of Us, Paul McCartney attempted to direct George's guitar part. Frustrated, George calmly responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." This quiet resignation marked the culmination of years of feeling creatively stifled. Although it seemed like a minor argument, it was the breaking point for George, who was tired of being pushed aside. His frustration led him to briefly leave the band in January 1969, a pivotal moment that showed how deeply the personal and professional conflicts had affected him. George's solo career and All Things Must Pass. In 1970, after the Beatles broke up, George Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been overlooked during his time in the band. The album was a commercial and critical success, showcasing Harrison's growth as a songwriter. It was a creative triumph, proving that George had more to offer than the world had seen during his time with the Beatles. The album featured a standout track, Wah Wah, which many believed was a veiled jab at Paul McCartney, reflecting Harrison's frustration with the band's dynamics. The song's upbeat tone contrasted with its biting lyrics, which served as a metaphor for the emotional turmoil George had endured. While All Things Must Pass marked a new chapter in Harrison's career, it also underscored the bitterness he still felt toward McCartney and the other Beatles. The Beatles reunion, a bitter return. In 1994, the surviving Beatles, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison, reunited to work on the Anthology project, completing John Lennon's unfinished demos and recording new material. While this reunion was seen as a moment of healing for many fans, George and Paul still found it difficult to work together. The old dynamics quickly resurfaced, with George bristling under Paul's direction. In interviews, George admitted that it felt like going back to school when he was in the studio with Paul. Producer Jeff Lynne, who worked with the Beatles during this period, recalled how George would often roll his eyes whenever Paul tried to take control. Despite their public appearances, the underlying tensions between the two were impossible to ignore, revealing that the wounds of the past had never truly healed. A guitar silenced. The psychological damage. By the 1970s, George had established himself as a respected solo artist, but the psychological damage caused by his years with the Beatles still lingered. In a candid radio interview in 1975, George admitted that his years working with Paul McCartney had left him with little confidence in his guitar playing. He said, "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul." This admission was both heartbreaking and revealing. Despite his legendary contributions to Beatles songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, George felt that Paul's constant interference and perfectionism had stunted his growth as a musician. The comment reflected the deep psychological impact his years in the Beatles had on him, shaping not just his musical career, but his view of collaboration and creativity. John Lennon, the unhealed wound. While George's frustrations with Paul McCartney were more visible, his relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complex and painful. In the early days of the Beatles, George looked up to Lennon as a mentor, but as time passed, their relationship began to deteriorate. John became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, and George found himself emotionally shut out. Lennon, who had once encouraged George's musical experimentation, became indifferent to his growing interest in Indian music and spirituality. This indifference hurt George deeply, as he sought solace in meditation and Hindu philosophy, but received little understanding from Lennon. The emotional distance between them grew, and when Lennon was tragically murdered in 1980, George's tribute was tinged with a sense of unresolved pain. The final years, quiet reflection. By the 1990s, George Harrison had moved beyond the shadow of the Beatles. He had become a respected solo artist and a philanthropist, quietly living out his spiritual beliefs. However, despite his peaceful exterior, the emotional scars from his Beatles years never fully healed. In interviews, George often reflected on the complexities of his time with the band, but he never romanticized the past. When asked if he missed being in the Beatles, George replied, "Not with the others, no." His blunt response revealed the depth of the wounds that had yet to heal. Even in his final years, George remained philosophical, quoting old proverbs and offering pointed reflections on his relationships with his former bandmates. George Harrison's final days and legacy. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer, which eventually spread to his lungs and brain. During his final years, he lived quietly with his wife Olivia and son Donnie at their home in Friar Park. Despite his illness, George's wit remained sharp, and in his last public appearance in 2001, he subtly referenced his past relationships, including his tension with Paul McCartney, through an old proverb. George passed away on November 29th, 2001, surrounded by loved ones. His final words, "Love one another," reflected his lifelong spiritual journey. Although the emotional complexities of his relationships remained unresolved, George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, spirituality, and quiet rebellion. His story was one of growth, frustration, and a search for peace, elements that resonate deeply in his music.